Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. To this webinar jointly organized by the International Resource Panel and the World Resources Forum. My name is Matthias Schlup. I'm the Managing Director of the World Resources Forum, and I have the pleasure to open this webinar while Merlyn Van Voore, Head of the International Resource Panel Secretariat, will be moderating today's panel discussion. At the occasion of the International Resource Panel 15th anniversary and the World Resources Forum 10th anniversary, we have decided to dive into a topic which we believe is crucial to ensure that the circular economy becomes an engine for shared prosperity. On a global level, how to manage the circular economy transition in order to ensure fairness and inclusiveness. As high-income countries accelerate their domestic transition, in fact, the geopolitical relations and trade flows of the current globalized linear economy will be disrupted, with far-reaching and asymmetric consequences for external countries. While this topic is gaining traction at the international level, we are still underexplored and not fully understood in all its ramifications. Today, thanks to the engagement of leading experts in the field, we aim at advancing our understanding and contributing to delineate a roadmap for a globally coordinated approach aimed at achieving sustainability and shared prosperity. Where are we? We are very happy to see such high interest in our session and to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining. Before I introduce the agenda, allow me to share just two housekeeping rules. First, this webinar is recorded, so by staying in the webinar, you actually agree to it, and all webinar participants are muted throughout the webinar. Therefore, any questions for the Q&A session should be typed using the Q&A function. Please make use of this. This should be an interactive webinar where you also can raise your questions, so please type it in the Q&A function in the chat function. We'll kick off today's webinar with an opening keynote by Janez Potočnik, followed by a panel debate with Mamphela Ramphele, Nabil Nasr, and Joanna Kulczycka. Merlyn Van Voore, Head of the International Resource Panel Secretariat, will moderate the panel discussion. Finally, there will be time for the Q&A, as mentioned already, with your questions, so please feel encouraged to ask these questions. Actually, throughout the webinar, we will organize the questions and summarize them and put them at the end, related to both the keynote and the panel discussions, of course. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Janez Potočnik, who will deliver the opening keynotes. Janez is co-chair of the International Resource Panel and, among other roles, is partner at Systemic and advisor to the European Forest Institute. Previously, he was European Commissioner for the Environment, and currently he is also a board member of the World Resources Forum Association. So, Janez, welcome to the event, and thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours. Yeah, you can share your screen now. Please go ahead, Janez.
Thank you, Matthias. Just to say that I'm also a member of the Club of Rome, since a lot of the substance will be also connected to that. But let me start sharing the screen, and I think we are almost ready to go. Yeah, that's it. So, closing the gap, global North-South relations. And first, let me try to put some of the main challenges in front of you, which are kind of a diagnosis of the problem. If we look to the biomass of life, then you would see very much on the bottom wild mammals, humans, and wild birds. So actually we are a minor part of the existing biomass of life. In particular, what is worrying is the wild birds and wild animals. But if you compare everything that to bacteria, fungi, archaea, viruses, plants, you would find out that the biomass of animals is actually the minor part of the rest of the biomass. But what is even more interesting is if you compare overall global biomass to anthropogenic biomass created by humans, so to concrete, bricks, aggregates, metals, asphalt, and other, we could find out that this is surpassing already the global biomass. But what is more worrying is that the trends are telling us that if we continue business as usual, this will be tripling the amount of global biomass by 2040. Even today, the plastic kingdom, it's double mass of the animal kingdom, including humans. For the first time in human history, we are the first generation actually, which is living in a socio-ecological system of the real planetary scope. So, which means that we are more interconnected and interdependent than we were ever. Which also means that our individual and collective responsibility has enormously increased. The Club of Rome has nicely painted that we have moved from so-called empty world, which was dominated by nature, to the full world, which is now dominated by humans. In the empty world, it was the labor and infrastructure which were the limiting factors of human well-being, while in the full world are natural resources and environmental sinks, which are the limiting factors of our human well-being. So if we want to talk about future economic development, it's practically impossible to talk about that without taking into account natural resources and environmental sinks. The donut perspective, which many of you have heard about it, it's identifying the inner circle as circle which is presenting basic human needs, which are expanding. The outer circles are the planetary boundaries, and the green part is actually the shrinking safe operating space. If we look to the planetary boundaries, we already see today that we are out of balance. Actually, if I would be more precise, this was very recently published, the picture it's getting, the overall situation, it's actually getting worse, not better, but I have kept the original one because of the next slides, which are trying to put everything in a kind of different national context. So if you would compare that, for example, for Malawi, China, Belgium, Australia, you would find out that from the national point of view, countries are surpassing planetary boundaries totally differently, which also means that the responsibility of the countries, at least for the past, it's more than clear. So if we would put all the countries together, we could actually identify three major spots. One consists from the countries which are not yet transgressing biophysical boundaries, but also not meeting well social thresholds. The other are the countries which are actually very quickly moving, because normally that is happening first in surpassing planetary boundaries, but not yet moving very quickly in meeting the social thresholds. And the third part are the high-income countries, where all those countries belong, which have high quality of life, but on the other hand, also very much surpassing the planetary boundaries. So the Dasgupta review, the economics of biodiversity, was very clear about what are the reasons for the situation which we are currently facing. It is highlighting two major failures. One is institutional failure. So we were never able to organize ourselves institutionally to be able to address those questions in a kind of effective way. And the second is the failure of the contemporary economics to acknowledge that we humans are embedded in and not external to nature, and of course, to also act accordingly. So if I simplify the story a bit, then we as producers and consumers appear on the markets where we apparently behave rational, but we behave rationally short-term here for us now, maximizing our well-being, our profits. But in essence, the fact is that the labor is more or less undervalued and nature not valued at all. And through that kind of signals which we are getting as producers and consumers, we are living in totally irrational, longer-term socio-economic and environmental imbalance. And as long as those signals will not change, we will have hard times to put anything in the kind of sustainability logic. But let me now move to the resources, which is the backbone of the International Resource Panel science. So we normally look to those questions through so-called DPSIR optic, drivers, pressure, state, impact, and response. When we talk about climate change, when we talk about biodiversity loss, pollution, we basically talk about state and impact. Immediately when you start to talk about drivers and pressures, you talk about humans, human activity, and natural resource use are actually a kind of a bridge between economics, economic results on one hand, and on the other hand, the overuse of those resources is the major reason that we are facing climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. Natural resources have been in human history always closely related to stability, conflicts, and wars. And by the way, according to our science, it's not, except in specific cases, which are also the reality today, it's not resource shortage, which will be the core limiting factor that we will need to change our behavior, but environmental and health consequences caused by this excessive and irresponsible use. So the country leaders didn't gather in Paris because we were running out of oil, but because the overuse of that oil was causing the problems which we all see in our climate change. When we talk about natural resources, we basically talk about biomass, metals, fossil fuels, and non-metallic minerals, which we are calling, with one word, materials. Everything extracted from Earth are materials. And on the top of that, of course, we should take into account also water and land. We also find out through our research that extracting and processing of natural resources actually drives all aspects of the triple planetary crisis. 90% of global land-related biodiversity loss and water stress are connected, majority, as you can see, through the biomass extraction and processing. 50% of the global climate change impacts and 1/3 of the air pollution health impacts. This is not capturing yet the households, the consumption. But if I can try to explain, if you buy a new car and you park it for the whole life, you have already caused 1/3 of the air pollution because resources needs to be extracted and car needs to be produced. And of course, this is a polluting process. We found out that in last 50 years, global material use has tripled since 1970, that it has almost doubled per capita, which means that majority of that tripling can be linked to the economic development, but important part is also the growth of population. But very, very interesting and important, it's also that the material productivity, that's the solid black line in your graph, has been increasing till the year 2000 and then started to decrease, which is quite difficult to understand because practically material productivity, which is the efficiency of the use of resources per unit of GDP, it's more or less increasing in all the countries. But if you look at it from a global level, more and more products which we today use, which we today consume, are actually produced now in countries which are less resource efficient. And before the year 2000, it was quite obvious that this shift happened from more resource intensive, more resource efficient countries to less resource efficient countries. If the current trends would continue, global material consumption is predicted to double by 2060. So it is no brainer that if we want still to keep our promises and hopes about growth of well-being, economic activity, we need to decouple that from the use of natural resources, and we need to decouple both from the environmental impacts. When we look to the disparities across income country groups, and we look to low income, lower middle, upper middle, and high income countries, we find out that if we look to the DMC, domestic material consumption, then already the upper middle income countries are the largest per capita material consumers. That could be easily understood because new infrastructure, cities built up, are actually built in those upper middle income countries the quickest, and this is quite a resource intensive process. But if you look to the material footprints, which are capturing who is actually consuming the products which are produced, then we find out that high income countries are far surpassing the others. Per capita consumption in high income countries, it's approximately 13 times higher than in low-income countries. And the key driver is, of course, outsourcing of material and resource-intensive production from high-income countries to those countries. So let me now try to move to the essential question which we try to address today. That's sustainable and equitable world. What needs to be done to change it? These things which I will be presenting to you are based on the joint work from Club of Rome and Systemic. And unfortunately, I will not be able to explain that in very much detail. But when we looked to the political system, we found out that there are some fundamental redefinitions needed. From redefining prosperity to redefining natural resource use, redefining progress, redefining metrics, redefining competitiveness, redefining incentives, redefining consumption, redefining finance, redefining governance, and finally, redefining leadership. Each of them are very in detail explained in the publication, which we call System Change Compass, and you are welcome to look at it, and you can find it on internet, of course. But when we came to the questions of the real economy, we have approached to those questions in a bit different way. We asked ourselves, which are the human needs which are most resource intensive? Because obviously, these are those we would need to address. So it's not sport, it's not culture, but most resource related human needs are nutrition, housing, mobility, and daily functional needs. But then there are other activities which are not direct human needs, but are enabling and supporting economic provisioning, economic systems, provisioning systems which are delivering human needs. So we can either directly use nature, so nature-based solutions, energy, which is directly not human need, but of course, without energy, none of the needs could be met. Materials, pretty much the same. And we added also innovation, digitalization, which is becoming pretty much a resource-intensive story. All of them are connected. And if I would try to put them all together, then this is how the whole system was designed. So 10 redefinitions, 8 economic provisioning systems. Then we have identified investment opportunities, 50 plus of them, which are aligned with the logic of the policy redefinitions and the new approach looked through the human needs perspective. And then for each of them, we have actually proposed some policy orientations for the redefinitions on policy level and for the specific, as we call it, economic ecosystems. So from that moment, this was published 2 years ago. And just recently, we asked ourselves different question, and we moved from this internal more to the external focus logic. And we call that international system change compass. So on the top of Club of Rome and Systemic, it was also Open Sciences Foundation who joined our work. Which are some initial consideration and facts? Implementing SDGs will have important international consequences. So if we take European Green Deal example, which is clearly specifying we know target of no net emissions of greenhouse gases in 2050, and where economic growth is decoupled from resource use, and this should be done in just and inclusive way. So that's actually how Europe is foreseeing implementation of SDGs in practice. And what was the question which we asked ourselves was how we should prepare and address the consequences which this decarbonization, decoupling, just inclusive transition commitment will have on geopolitical relations and also on trade flows. For example, one of the facts is that today more than half of physical trade in shipping is actually in fossil fuels, which means that if we are serious and we will be in 2050 decarbonized, what and where this sector and where these geopolitical consequences of disappearance of that and actually different kind of focus will go. So high income countries are absolutely surpassing planetary boundaries most. And we think that this also clearly points to the fact that they need to lead the transition by example. In overusing and Earth resources in distributing the benefits unfairly. Our economic model is taking far more than the planet can sustainably give. So resource use has significantly truly improved living standards and well-being, in particular in high-income countries, but this now comes with unprecedented cost, which you know. The real problem is that humankind has never separated economic growth from ever-rising demand for resources, and as a result, we are now overstepping planetary boundaries, again, in particular in high-income countries, and we are locking ourselves out of the safe operating space in which human societies evolved. This is certainly not an easy shift. But for example, take any well-functioning city with high scores in quality of life. What do they provide? They all provide high level of active mobility, compact yet balanced neighborhoods, access to local healthy food. Basically, they deliver a high quality of life through shifts in provisioning systems where we need to save virgin resources at scale, as we have identified before. But we have looked also very carefully, what are the main blind spots which we can identify in our policymaking? And we have identified basically three. One is the lack of the systemic approach. So public leaders lack capacity or knowledge of how to translate system change visions into their concrete policies, investment structures, which ends then in conflicting policy logic that hinder real transformation. The second is resource perspective. Resource perspective, it's also in many policies actually lacking. In fact, we should not talk only about lack in the policy, it's also lack in the business sector optic. It's lack even among the civil society. And finally, what we also identified is that demand side focus is dominating. It's dominating the overall analysis. So policy attention is giving to supply side of the economy. Demand side is missing. Policy attention is mainly given to the supply side of the economy, to the cleaning of the existing economic system, but improving the wrongnesses of the economic system, making it more efficient, will certainly not do the trick. And by the way, without focusing on demand side, we actually not address the real questions which are linked to the fairness and equity. I will just give you the climate change example. So first about the system approach. This is the UNFCCC focus, carbon emissions. They don't talk a lot about air pollutants, affordable goods and services, overconsumption, inequality, resource scarcity, education, health, ecotoxicity, and I could continue. So their focus is, of course, this is creating some trade-offs. Instead, we would look for synergies and potential multiple benefits. If I give you just one example, the Glasgow breakthrough, which was announced on road transport, was we should aim for zero-emission vehicles to be the new normal, accessible, affordable, and sustainable in all regions by 2030. Of course, this is something which is part of the answer, but this would create enormous problems if we would really go for that. Because if you look from the system perspective to road transport, there are at least 5 levers, 3 in the reduced demand for car-based transport, reduced overall mobility need, modal shift, higher utilization of vehicles, and 2, in ensuring remaining vehicles as sustainable as possible. Electrification based on renewable energy. So that's basically the slide which I showed before, and circularity, maximizing value of the used materials. If we look to the problem from the lack of resource perspective, this is the slide which we have produced 10 years ago in the IRP. So normally the problem is analyzed through the GHG emissions optic. We see here on the left-hand side renewables, and on the right-hand side fossil fuels. The answer is straightforward and clear when you look through GHG emissions, human health, ecosystems health. But if you look it through land use and even more through material requirements, then suddenly, of course, you start to look at using and transiting to renewable energy will not be such a simple endeavor, and that we have to take those things into account. I'm not saying that we should not go there, on the contrary, but I'm just saying that those things need to be taken into account. And when we look to G20 nationally determined contributions and long-term climate plans, the analysis in systemic find out that we have 10 times more proposals on energy efficiency than on the resource efficiency in built environment. And when we look to mobility, 4 times more on energy efficiency than on the resource efficiency. So if we want to be efficient, we need to combine supply side solutions with demand side solutions, and of course, nature-based solutions, which are normally most effective and also the cheapest. And finally, the last blind spot is demand side focus. So focusing on supply side, focusing only on cleaning supply side will simply not be enough, nor will lead to a fairer and more equal world. Our international efforts also on climate crisis remain focused on driven by the supply side. And this will, as it's acknowledged also in the latest IPCC report, it will not deliver the target set because it is missing an important part of the effectiveness of demand policies. We must stop ignoring the wastefulness of our production and consumption. For example, it would be in vain to decarbonize the production of steel if it's used to produce underused cars and houses, which contribute to traffic and property market bubbles, but not to real social prosperity. More fundamentally, demand-side measures get us closer to the essential questions of who is responsible, to the questions which lead to equity. NDCs and other national climate commitments should thus consider, including also footprint-based indicators and resource-related targets. We should move from product maximization to providing human needs. We don't need cars, we need mobility. We don't need light bulbs, we need light. We don't need chairs, we need to sit. We don't need refrigerators, we need chilled and healthy food. We don't need CDs, we want to listen to the music. We don't need pesticides, we need healthy plants. So dematerialization, rethinking the ownership, efficiency complemented by the sufficiency measures, exactly the direction in which we should go. Finally, some important conclusions from this work. The problem primarily lies in our economic model, which is not valuing natural resources. So economic theory is based on rational behavior of consumers and producers. More we produce at the lowest possible price, higher the capital returns and GDP growth. Undervalued labor, in many cases not valued nature by our markets, are leading to systemic social environmental imbalances. Imagine that you are a customer in the food center, you enter, you don't pay, go home. Do you think that this food shop center would not get bankrupt? That's exactly what we are currently doing to nature. We are entering the nature, using it, and not actually valuing it. And as Arto Pasilina very well titled his novel, is leading to charming mass suicide. That's why ambitious policies today face an uphill battle. While sending policy signals one way, so act responsibly, but market signals other way, don't act responsibly, it's creating confusion. Not to mention intense lobbying by companies' fear of loss of profitable markets. So it's time to stop signaling producers that destroying natural capital is free of charge. And it's time to stop contradictory messages to consumers who still routinely pay more for the food with low environmental impact instead of the reverse. More resilient economy is possible only on a more resilient planet, and more resilient society is possible only in a fairer and more equal world. So we can simply not afford to discontinue our sustainability efforts, since we are simultaneously dealing with chronic crises. We can no longer ignore how fragile our economies and societies are. If we merely treat the short-term pain, the next crisis will again find us searching in panic for ad hoc solutions. The map of resource use still shows the shadows of an imperialistic world, where wealthy nations pursue their ambitions at the expense of others. Making our economies and societies more resilient and fair, it's thus our best defense against any future countries. We need a systemic approach aligned with SDGs, and it should be the countries which are causing most of the problem, those who are in lead. Multiple approach, which I'm explaining, is a long way from the economic counteroffensive single swift response which many times, even today, political and media logic demands. But for us, who are taking care for planetary crisis, cumulative effect of many positive system-changing decisions, it's almost the only way keeping a stable and safe world in the reach. So we should reassess the values. We should rethink our economies and reduce our consumption and resource use. Standards and behavioral patterns linked to the current economic model were set by high-income countries, and we are ethically bound to show that we are willing and able to change a reality created and to lead the essential transition at home and globally. But while the responsibility for the past is clear, responsibility for the future is joint and common. For the future we want, we must enter the untapped territories. And if we want really to avoid extinction of elephants in nature, we must first extinct some elephants which are still sitting in our rooms. Thank you for your attention. Merlyn, to you.
Thank you, Janez. As always, very provocative, but also very thoughtful, meaning you've given our panelists, who I will soon introduce, and our audience a lot of things to think about. These issues are complex. We know we're going to have different views, which is why this particular event is so important with our co-host, the World Resources Forum. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to remind the audience, you will have a time later on to pose questions to Janez and others. A few things that struck me was you ended off by saying, you know, who is responsible? We have a duty to value natural resources. You were very strong in coming out on the issue that the current policy signals are not aligned with market signals. You were also very strong on the issue of consumption and continuing at the rate we are continuing, and who is benefiting from that. And you made points about the need to redefine progress, competitiveness, finance, etc. And also which human needs are resource intensive, and how do we meet human needs in a different economic model and in different ways. I know most of you are following this, have made your own notes, but as I say, Janez is known to always call a spade a spade. So I'm glad you've taken notes. I will quickly introduce our panelists, and I will start with introducing Dr. Mamphela Ramphele. She's the co-president of the Club of Rome. And Dr. Mamphela Ramphele has been, as many of you know, a medical doctor, an activist, a researcher, worked in global forums. She was a founding trustee of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, has received numerous awards for her work. And I could go on and on and on, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele, but I think many of us are familiar with your commitment to justice issues and also issues that you think require research. We can see your banner at the back where it proudly says global equity for a healthy planet. So I don't even need to tell people what your current focus is right now. Then we've got Dr. Nabil Nasr, and Dr. Nabil is one of the IRP's long-standing researchers. Welcome, Nabil. He works as the director at the Institute for Sustainability at Rochester Institute of Technology in the US. His current work is focused on remanufacturing, and he's leading a piece of work for the IRP on consumer electronics and what that means. So also very interesting in terms of what you were saying, Janez. And then we've got Dr. Joanna Kulczycka, who you just said, I think you said it was 6, I hope not. Hopefully it's only 7, but welcome, Joanna. Always good to have you. Joanna is also one of our experts in the IRP, and she focuses a lot on the economics of the entire supply chain, very interested in raw materials, recycling, and circular economy. I am going to start the first round of questions. And Dr. Mamphela Ramphele, I'm turning to you. You've heard Janez, and you've heard that one of his key issues is that right now, natural resources in terms of extraction, production, and consumption has a disproportionate impact on low-income countries. So he's highlighted that in high-income countries, in his words, due to their overconsumption patterns, are still driving what he calls global North-South relations, where low and middle income countries, which need to develop, and in his words, also have the benefits of well-being, valuing human well-being needs. And one of his arguments is that if we don't fix this imbalance, then, to put it simply, we are not serious. And so my question to you is, what's your response or comment to what was one of Janez's key things about this imbalance between the so-called global North and the so-called global South when it comes to the way we manage and consume and produce our natural resources? Over to you, Dr. Ramphele.
Thank you very much to everybody, Merlyn, and of course to Janez for the rich paper that she has shared with us. I want to start with the issue that precedes the point that Janez just put to us about the imbalance. And that really comes from what we often forget. There's a huge blind spot about legacy issues. The very use of the term global North, global South indicates a political assumptions that were made about who names who, because for my continent, for example, there are more countries in Africa which are north of the equator, but they're not called part of the global South. Also, the issue of how did we come to define high income and low income countries? High income countries are countries that have been part and parcel of the production of low income countries, in the sense of the extractive economies that was driven by colonial conquest sought to extract resources from now the so-called low-income countries to the high-income countries. Unless we take that legacy into consideration, it's difficult to then devise ways in which we can acknowledge this interconnectedness and interdependence of all of life, but particularly of human beings, because we thrive best when surrounded by people who acknowledge and respect our being. And so to come to the question that one could say, how do we build cooperation between what we currently have as a divided global community? First, I think we need to rename. We need to rename this whole issue of global North and global South and talk about most of the world versus the rest. because most of the world is what we call the global south. But we also have to accept that because human beings are a species that is interrelated, it thrives on relationality. So by acknowledging the things that break those chains, those links within the interdependent, interrelated human community, we will not be able to make the progress that we need to make. Europe, for example, find it difficult to see the people on the side where I sit as people that they can deal with, not in terms of what is the current status, but also factor in how have we come to where we are. High income didn't start in Europe. It started here where I'm sitting now with a low income or middle income country. And so acknowledgement of legacy is absolutely fundamental. And with that, addressing some of the issues that create blind spots, racism, sexism, issues of superiority and inferiority are critical. Because if we believe that we are one human race, we will not be at peace with parts of the world that have to survive on as little as Janez showed us in his screens, whilst waste and overconsumption happens in the other part of the world. If you are members of one family, you cannot allow yourself to eat whilst your siblings are not eating. And we don't have that disposition as a global community today because we don't own, or we don't, the values that we hold in international relationships are not values of Ubuntu, connectedness, compassion that is at the heart of the human story. So I believe in the final instance, we need to look to nature and build on nature's intelligence to see how nature manages issues, including crises, even crisis of extinction. Nature deals with them by drawing from the wisdom of the ancients and to allow each ecosystem to regenerate to the best of its ability. And I think we have neglected nature, not only at not giving it economic value, but we have neglected the wisdom that is in nature, that our ancient ancestors understood so well. Thank you.
Very, very passionate and very clear, acknowledging legacy issues. You cannot talk about interconnectedness without understanding what these terms and concepts mean, where they come from. And maybe we need to introduce new language. I've just made a note of a beautiful quote you've just said so that we don't miss it, that members of one family, you cannot allow yourself to eat if somebody else cannot eat. Obviously, the values of Ubuntu, and for people who don't understand what that means, we can also explain later. And then for you to end it by saying, let's return to fundamental values like nature. And then you've also brought in a lot of social dimensions, which is around racism, sexism, inferiority, superiority. And as you said, otherwise we will not be able to be in a place of peace and to be able to, as Janez would like, to undo this inequality and inequity. So thank you for that, Dr. Ramphele. Nabil, as you've listened to Dr. Ramphele, who's really now taken this conversation to a very different level. And as I said to the audience, your focus has really been understanding the circular economy. You've looked at issues of industrial development. You understand the entire chain of creating economic value in a circular economy. And the question was, how do you think countries, and I always am careful to choose my words, so I will always, when I talk, I say in the so-called global south, so-called. What type of economic activities do you think needs to be adopted to help generate prosperity and to help generate value in terms of our global supply chain? Nabil.
Yeah, thanks, Merlyn. This is really a terrific question, and I think the good news, bad news, is that there are many of the challenges as we talk about, as Dr. Ramphele said, it's the rest of the world versus the developed countries that actually have significant industrial development as well as significant consumption, as well as Janez actually articulated very well. So the challenges is that we have system issues and we have issues related to the structure of the global economy, and a lot of those issues will take time to address, and they're not easy to address. They are complex issues. And then there are issues that really are more local issues that I believe can be addressed with local economies, and it can accelerate the cycle of transition to circular economy if the proper action are taken. So there are things that I think that are would take longer and more complex, but there are a lot of issues that are much easier for us to address, but it would require some time, resources, and the will to do so. So if we talk about circular economy, and I think there is a significant realization that the circular economy would lead to economic growth and job creation opportunities, which is what really is needed for spurring economic growth in many countries. In addition, circular economy contributes to meeting the goals of decoupling, and it's truly, I saw one of the questions from one of our audience, yes, we truly can achieve decoupling of economic growth from environmental degradation. The level of decoupling here can be debatable, but it's definitely something that is achievable if proper action are taken. In other words, circular economy supports growth needed to enhance economies, and GDP growth is needed to enhance the well-being and standard of living in many of the, as Merlyn said, the global south, or Dr. Ramphele called it, the rest of the world. That can be done without degrading environmental quality in many of those countries. So just an example in terms of really where the circular economy, when it's implemented, can lead to economic growth. In the US, for example, if I use the US as an example, the remanufacturing sector employ 180,000 people, contributing about 80 billion to the US economy. The recycling industry, for example, in the US employ 160,000 people, contributing about 116 billion to the US economy. And those industries are not necessarily highly supported and highly endowed by a lot of sources in the US, and they consist of a lot of small to medium-sized businesses. Those can be duplicated. The models of this industry can be duplicated around the globe. In the EU also, there's significant data there related to the potential for circular economy to increase resource productivity by about 3% annually in Europe, and also realize economic benefit of 0.3 trillion per year by 2030. This is according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So the opportunity for the rest of the world in circular economy, in my mind, are significant. And if we focus on the near-term issues that can be implemented, I think a lot of it require more desire and will from many countries to actually seek implementation of many of those measures. For example, we have something, we call it in the US MRFs, and MRF is a material recovery facility. And those facilities actually do significant work to recover material and bring it back to the recycling stream. And they typically are high labor intensive industries, as well as the remanufacturing industry, that typically do not require the same capital equipment, the same investment that you would need to build the new product and typically far easier to implement by countries than it is to actually build a brand factories for new products. So there is a lot of opportunities in those areas, and those are within reach, and there are some barriers that I'm happy to talk about later that make a lot of progress in this area not feasible and not near term.
Great. Thanks, Nabil. Joanna, turning to you. So Nabil just cited a statistic. He says, according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, potentially there can be $0.3 trillion generated per year by 2030 in terms of the opportunities of the circular economy. Big figure. Now let's say that that is feasible. Your work in the area that you've been working, particularly in remanufacturing and reuse, is there something that you think is possible to generate this kind of success? Given your context, particularly the Polish context, and you may even want to speak about other contexts. Joanna.
Thank you very much for this question, and thank you for underlining the circular economy and recycling as it is. I think I believe in this. I believe in circular economy, and based on Poland as an example, where the eco-innovation of Polish economy is much below EU level, and where we can create the recycling industry through the clustering. That's, I think, what we really need for views development is, first of all, the good networking and good education. So without such a cooperation between the science and industry, it would be extremely difficult. That's the one point. The second point is we need broader information, we need broader education about this. And based on example in Poland, where we have also a very intensive mining industry, we could create something as 10 years ago as a cluster, waste management and recycling cluster, through the cooperation between the science and industry, and mainly small and medium enterprises for creating the resource perspective. And I think that this is something what is really needed. We believe that such a cooperation and interdisciplinary research, that's something what really push the economy. So the information, the good practice, and the exchange of information, this is something what is needed. The most important is to when we look for a resource efficient perspective from the recycling point of view, is the whole value chain perspective. So from the collection, removal, treatment, and recovery. When we look at the waste, so waste can be the valuable product, and when we look at this through the cooperation and networking, I hope it can really be a perspective for the future. So based on our experience through the cooperation and networking, it helps a lot develop the local scale, and through the local scale we can go more interdisciplinary and more global for this, to offer such a cooperation and new products from this. As based on our experience, it was bottom-up approach for cooperation within the EU policy, which support us for the cooperation. So hoping it will go that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. What I'm going to do now, so that we have a more interactive and free-flowing discussion, I'm going to turn to Dr. Ramphele. You've heard Nabil, you've heard Joanna. You've heard their views on where value can be created, etc. If you reflect on what they've said, any response from your side?
I mean, the issue of circular economy or circularity of use of material resources begs the question, what are the initial choices made in terms of material? Janez talked a lot about the way we have tended to over extract and overuse material, and therefore whatever we do, we not only have to recycle what we have used, but we've got to actually stop, interrupt the wastage, the production and the use of materials that make even the recycling process not as effective as it could be. I have a deep problem with the MacArthur Foundation projections of generating economic value. It depends on how you value, what is of value and how you value it. There is a paper done by a Club of Rome member, Mone Mostert, which is posted on our website. And that what he's raising there is that even in the discussions of circular economy, we create a lot of waste and overuse because we don't interrupt the cycle of overconsumption in the process. Not necessarily. I'm not criticizing what my colleagues on the panel are saying, but I'm saying in addition to what you are talking about, humanity has to review, not just simply do a little bit of reforms here and there, but radically alter our relationships with material resources and with the energy use. And I also believe we don't do enough to draw from indigenous wisdom. I live on a continent. I think here in Africa, we can do a lot better if we were to use the kind of material resources that don't cause too much disruptions and disturbance of the natural resources. I grew up in a mud hut, which is made with mud bricks and thatch roofs. Now, those dwellings are very durable, they're very sustainable, and they use very little energy because they are internally temperature controlled. So yes, circularity is important, but we also have to ask the question, shouldn't we be stopping to produce things which are damaging to our economy? Plastics, cigarettes, poisons, bombs, arms, because those we can't necessarily recycle, we should really stop. So I think circularity is important as an interim measure, but what is required is complete radical rethinking of how we relate to the living system in which we are nested as a human race in a way that's not as damaging as we have been damaging the ecosystem all along.
Thank you. And in fact, this takes me to Nabil, because Nabil, you've worked as an advocate and as an academic and trying to influence policymakers on what we call the transition and the adoption of the circular economy. And having heard what Dr. Ramphele just said, what's your response?
Well, first of all, I'm so glad Dr. Ramphele actually addressed this issue related to consumption and related to, sometimes the unnecessary production of maybe a product that can be, we can optimize or maybe are not needed or something that actually can have an alternative to. In my work, we look primarily on the nuts and bolts of actually how you implement circular systems and how you accelerate the transition of circular economy in different countries. And the study that I did under IRP that was published 2 years ago, that's also available on our website, was really trying to address a lot of those issues. And the title for the study actually was redefining value, and we studied very carefully the implementation or the application of circular economy in 4 countries, 2 developed countries and 2 developing countries. And what we discovered in the study, there were four type of barriers that existed to implementation of circular economy. First of all, when we modeled the with different scenarios, one scenario was business as usual, one scenario was focused on basically the most probable scenario that can exist was eliminating barrier, and the third one with a theoretical high, if we eliminated all the barriers, what would be the impact on those countries? And it was so clear that the implementation of circular economy would have significant impact on the emission generation in this country, waste generation, consumption, and also would have very positive impact on job creation and economic development. And those barriers, as we looked at the barriers, as I mentioned earlier, there are some structural issues, system issues that are much more difficult to deal with the global economy. But there are a lot of issues that are in the hands actually of many countries they can address. And those, for example, one of the major barriers that we found, and specifically existing in the rest of the world, as Dr. Ramphele said, is that there are a lot of structural policy within the regulatory structure, within the policies that exist in many countries that are not, that really result in reducing significantly the volume and the trade of those circular products. So while there is a desire to implement circular economy, we found that there are significant barriers in the trade and in the potential for companies within those countries to actually implement circular economy. There are significant barriers existing there. And those barriers were the dominant barriers. If we can overcome those barriers, and there is a more of supportive system for circular product like remanufactured product, refurbished product, and so on, we found that there are 3 other barriers that exist. One of them is a technical barriers. And basically that's the know-how, the ability for organizations around the globe to be able to remanufacture, refurbish, and bring product back through a reverse logistics system like the condition. The other barrier was market barriers. You know, while many countries actually can benefit tremendously from circular product like remanufacture, refurbish, we found that the market doesn't accept those products easily. You know, countries, for example, that can take great advantage of medical equipment, hospital equipment that are refurbished or remanufactured to meet the same standard as new product, banning the use of those products in those countries, and the market doesn't accept them. So a lot of the challenges we have is that also there are certain market barriers. So if you even start producing products, circular products there, it's hard to sell them. And that requires a lot of time to go over that market transformation. The third one is related to the recovery and infrastructure. So that require investment and that require resources to build the infrastructure to allow for that circular model to exist in many countries around the globe. We have countries like Nigeria and Africa, for example, where there's this high level of consumption of many products. And the fact is that the infrastructure has to exist in order for circular product or circular organization to develop in this country to basically able to address a lot of the needs for that market, but which also result in significant economic advantage for the users, for the consumers in those countries, because circular products like refurbished or remanufactured product, for example, typically are sold as at least half the cost of new products. So it has significant economic advantage. So those are the 4 barriers. Again, the policy, regulation, market access, technical barriers, market barriers, infrastructure barriers, and those represent basically the most common barriers that we see exist, you know, around the globe.
Thanks, Nabil. And of course, my observation is that these barriers are not unusual when it comes to transitioning from one state of being to another. And the reason why I'm saying that is that I want to move to Joanna to make it bring us a bit more local, and given her experience, and say, with her experience, and I mentioned, or I thought I heard you say, Joanna, your focus on small, medium enterprises. And that must have taken a different approach of knowledge and education. Tell us a little bit about this. I'm going to put you on the spot for 2 minutes, because we have a lot of questions coming in from our chats, which is fantastic, because then it is truly an interactive discussion. So Joanna, open over to you before I take the questions that are already coming in through our chat box.
Thank you very much for this one. I fully agree with someone notes that circular economy is necessary, but not enough. But what is very important, we have the different barriers like legal, like market, but also the education, the knowledge about what circular economy is, because it's very often treated as a waste management. And for us, it's not waste management strategy, it's resource management strategy. What is the most important for us, where we're talking with small and medium enterprise, and also what is really needed, it's the holistic approach. But the other things which is also very important for us, that we are talking about the services, what was underlined, that we are not only talking about the technology, but about the business model we change, and to use to more promote the product as service, not only as the product that we have to have something. And if we learn and we can see the benefit from this, I think that would be the most important, that it's not only the necessary of new investment, but the new way of thinking, to use a lot of things as a service, not only as own, but as use it, what was underlying this. And I think this is for business model, for SME, as a chance for development, create the new market for the cooperation, for sharing a lot of things. So with 2 minutes, thank you for this one. We can't hear you, Merlyn. We can't hear you.
Sorry, you would think that by now we'd learn how to unmute ourselves. But I was saying right on the clock. We've got a lot of questions coming in. And Emmanuel, if you're online, I'm going to also ask you to help me manage, because there's a lot. I've got the first one to Janez, and the question is decoupling technically possible, or is degrowth the way to go?
I knew you will ask me that. No, but if you allow me, I would comment that and on the circular economy, because I think a lot of important things were said by the colleagues there.
And you know that I'm watching the clock, right?
Yeah, of course. So I think in the first place, when you talk, is it possible only in degrowth concept? The first question is how you measure the growth. If you measure the growth so that that humanity, it's growing only in economic terms through the GDP, of course, you have a problem. But one of the things which we are exactly doing in our next Global Resource Outlook is that we are moving from this kind of perception to the well-being concept, because it is pretty much necessary that we do it. But if you talk about well-being, you can aspire about improving the well-being. And I think that's not in contradiction. But even if you go into the bare concept of GDP, which as it is existing today, one of the arguments which I have heard is that we have never in history decoupled economic growth from energy and material use. But if we are sincere, we have never really tried it. So we are just last year starting to talk about those kind of policies and starting to understand that this insane consumption, which Mamphela is talking about, it's leading somewhere which is not the good way to go. So if you go more in incentivizing producers in the direction that they use less resources, so more in the direction of everything as a service model, I think it's absolutely possible. But it has a lot of side questions like ownership, which we got used to, and many of the things which we would need to deal with. So it will be a deep system transformation that we will go that way. But unfortunately, we don't have a reasonable and serious alternative if we want to talk about those things. And when we are talking about consumption, it's not equal talking about consumer, because consumption to a large extent, it's actually created by overproduction, which is driven by production side intentionally because consumers are abused. I will stop here because I will be too long. But I would really like in the second round to comment on circular economy.
Thanks. Then we have a question to Dr. Ramphele. It says, if talking about global north, global south is not correct, which terms should be used that's less discriminatory, but still allows for conceptual clarity? It looks like there are still significant differences between these countries. So isn't that a relevant distinction? Over to you, Dr. Ramphele.
There is, the distinction is not inherent. The distinction is a result of interactions and economic relations, political decisions that were taken that created this gulf. That's why I disagree with the labeling of countries as developed and developing. Developing where to? I don't want to be like the United States, but we do want to have well-being and compassionate, caring societies. And those societies, if we look at indigenous wisdom and where it has been used to inform how we use science and technology, then you can, in fact, end up with societies that are more equitable, where there is well-being for all and less waste, etc. The North-South is where you stand. Where are you standing to call someone North or South? It's like developed, advanced, and non-advanced. But the main question in terms of the distinction is about who extracted the material resources, which we are now talking about, whether it's mining, whether it's fossil fuels, whatever materials we're talking about, and to what use were those materials put. It is, so the issue, I guess, in my intervention is not to say I have the right definitions, but I am challenging the existing definitions because they allow us to have the blind spots that Janez was referring to, but we need to go much deeper to be more conscious of the fact that we cannot ignore where we come from in order to map the path to the future. Circularity and use of material in a sustainable way is inherently what ancient wisdom was about.
Thank you. We have another question, and I think I'm going to give this one to you, Nabil. The question is, basically, it says, what can be done to improve integration of the so-called systems approach into decision-making? What role does politics play in preventing or enabling this integration? So my shorthand understanding of this question is really a political economy question. And in this discussion, Nabil, I think you started mentioning it, but we haven't really, and Dr. Ramphele also mentioned it, but we haven't really also focused on the so-called political economy issues. Janez did a little bit, but we tend to look at it from a very technical point of view. Nabil, over to you.
Well, I mean, that is really one of the toughest questions to deal with, is how do you integrate that system level thinking and that system approach with ultimately with the decision making. You know, the challenge with circular economy is that for many years, as our system developed from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it evolved in a certain way that resulted in what we have today. You know, a lot of the thinking at the time is that we had abundance of resources and abundance of materials, and we had limited waste, and a lot of the decision making as we make product, the decision making about material selection, everything else came as a result of that system that evolved. We really never had that broader system thinking that to guide the decision making process. So from a technical perspective and engineering perspective, and I let my friend Janez talk about the political dimension of this, but from a technical perspective, I think the challenge we have is that we have been talking about a lot of those issues for so long, but we typically, when it comes to decision makers, when the end of the day, design engineer is sitting down and making decisions related to material selection process, and a lot of choices that impact the consumer, you know, that we lack the information. We have absolutely limited knowledge of what we need to know to actually make the right decision. And what is the right decision? At IRP, we had a lot of discussion related to science-based targets and many issues that is still very much in discussion, and the progress hasn't been made in a lot of those issues. So from a technical perspective, I would say, I think we need to do a lot more than we're doing today to ensure that we actually have conclusive data and guidance that guide that decision-making process. I think at the higher level, the political side, I would let my colleague here, Janez, talk about that side, but really is a lot of it is that I think circular economy, we've been talking about circular economy since 2012, and we haven't still made a lot of progress in ensuring that the information to decision makers is there to guide their decision. We have many organizations that are really trying to do the right thing, but in many cases, they're not equipped with the right information to guide them to know what that right thing is. So typically we go after things that are very clear and obvious, but the difficult ones are really tough to address at this point in time.
Thank you, Nabil. And I'm going to come back to you, Joanna. One of the questions, which is a bit long, so I'm going to try and summarize. One question says that advanced economies have an issue of distribution that they need to solve, and that they need degrowth. Less advanced economies still need to grow in order to establish social well-being. Circular economy as a concept is captured by linear thinking. So this means it's either recycling or placing the issue on the burden or the shoulders of the consumer. In your context, how have you tackled that kind of understanding based on what you told us on the work that you're doing in Poland? Over to you, Joanna.
Okay, so from the point of circular economy, what we think through the barriers and through the development of this, first of all, from the consumer point of view, when we look at the demand side, I think that what we need the most is we need the product or service which are of good quality, of high quality, and that we need not only the mass, not the mass and longer, but we need the product of or service even, which are quality, higher quality. That's something what really can develop, and people want to have it. If it's from the secondary resources or it's this new kind of service. And I think that's really help develop the economy like on this way, that it's the not intermediate product, not something which is not as good, but something which is much better. But what we would like to have, that's from create the demand. And I think that would be something what need and can grow the economy from the perspective of producer SME. When we talk with them in the circular economy, we need to find win-win situations. So economic viable and environmental friendly. And also it's possible with this business model. So, but you have to really look at the quality of the products. That's what I think help us with the transition to the product or service, with the transition to the circular economy.
Thanks a lot, Joanna. And I'm going to move to you, Janez, as we come to a close. There's been a few questions in the chat box. Let's see if we have some time. One of the questions, and I know this is an issue that also is part of your day-to-day life, and this issue is about measurement. So how do we measure efficiency is a question in a circular economy. What kind of indicators should we be using? And then there was a question about, don't you think, Janez, that what lacks the circularity argument is how practical and quantifiable can it be?
Yeah.
Over to you, Janez.
Thank you. It's difficult to measure the circular economy effects. That's why I will put it in the context of what actually circular economy is and how we should understand it. Circular economy is certainly not a silver bullet or a panacea. So I think that's clear to everybody of us here around the table. But is this a useful concept? Of course, it's a useful concept because it's the oldest concept on the earth, because the whole nature is circular economy, bioeconomy actually. And if we are considering ourselves as part of nature, which we are not, and hopefully, and one of the comments was also that we should not be about the nature, which I fully agree, then of course circularity should be something entirely normal and acceptable for us as a concept. But like all the concepts, it's how you define it, how you measure it. And one thing which we are absolutely lacking, and this is, by the way, Merlyn, also the central part of the piece which will be released in a few days, the co-chair's piece of the IRP, is actually trying to put the focus on how to reduce the natural resource use. Of course, with all recycling and everything, you are reducing it, but in the first place, not putting it on the market or meeting the needs in a different way, which, since I was a long time in policy making and also introducing the circular economy concept in Europe, in political space at least, we were never talking about those things, if we are honest. And they are now more coming into the center of our attention. And the last point which I want to do about the circular economy is circular economy should certainly not be used as an excuse not to firmly focus on the things which Mamphela actually underlined, the complete rethinking of economic model, which is absolutely needed. It should be not an excuse, because we will simply not find the answer there for some of the things which are happening through the signals which we are sending to producers and consumers on the market. And if we do not fundamentally change these signals, which are currently still saying, just use nature because it's cheap, and you can embed it in your products and you can sell as much as possible, then we will have a huge problem. So for me, what we could immediately start, and it's really difficult not to understand why we don't more seriously start on that front, it's subsidies. So we should stop subsidizing the things which are wrong things and which are not consistent with the future, which we, by the way, all agree about. Second, we should start using taxes not only to fill the budgets and make the budgets balanced, but use the structure of the taxes to support something and to use something to not support something through the tax incentives. And finally, we should stop with this insanity of tax havens, which are benefiting only the richest and the biggest companies. And these are no-brainers. And these are core signals which we are sending to everybody around the world, saying, no, this is somehow acceptable, and this is what we are ready to live with. None of the circular economy will help if we don't fix those things. But circular economy is certainly an important instrument to put on the agenda some of the questions which, by the way, 10 years ago were absolutely missing and not there.
Absolutely. So what I'm going to do, because we're getting close to the end, I'm going to give Dr. Ramphele, Nabil, and Joanna last thoughts, and then I'm going to wrap up. Thank our participants who stayed with us through this hour and a half. Dr. Ramphele, any last words based on what you've heard from your fellow participants?
Thank you very much. This has been an important conversation. My takeaway is we need to reimagine our relationships as a human family. There is enough for all of us in the world if we focus on well-being for all and we learn from Mother Nature how to use materials and other resources in a way that advances well-being for all.
Thank you so much. Joanna?
I think one of the most important aspects is to try to collaborate instead of competitive, create the network and value chain. It is especially important for small and medium enterprise because they could be visible with their work on this and that they create the common value generation. So hoping we move through this direction also in the policy for supporting such behavior.
Thank you, Joanna. Nabil?
I think I would just like to close with an urging all of us to think about what we can do today while we're working on some of the fundamental issues that we need to address and the complex issues which definitely need to be addressed. But I think I would love to see us making progress in areas where we can do things today. I think even at the system level, Janez talked about some issues that can be done quickly. In the implementation side, I think of moving to circular models, there are a lot of things that also we can do in the near term. And I would urge us to continue to make progress while we're addressing the fundamental challenges that we face.
Great. And so we're 2 minutes away, and I'll quickly give you some of my takeaways, and I'll start with the end. And the end being, Dr. Ramphele said it, Joanna, you spoke about thinking local. What does it mean for people? Nabil, you're also talking about what it is mean for people. And we started this conversation, and the chapeau was, we spoke about just, fair transition to a circular economy. Janez reminded us this is not the panacea. Janez also always has the greatest lines that I always take notes of. He said, for example, we have to stop the insanity of tax havens. So that's a topic for another day. But more importantly, we spoke about that there is, and Dr. Ramphele, you said there's enough for all of us in this world. Nabil, you reminded us about a lot of the technical barriers which needs to be overcome. We spoke about some of the difficult conceptual issues, and I think this will be an ongoing conversation. We know that this issue of is decoupling technically possible, degrowth, etc. This is not the end of the conversation today. And then we also spoke a lot about systems issues, and I'm not going to go into that. But I do want to say thank you to our colleagues at the World Resources Forum for putting this together. I also want to say thank you for all of you who participated in this particular webinar. I know that there was about 200 plus participants online. We couldn't engage with all of your comments, but the fact that the comment box was so lively tells us this conversation resonated with a lot of people. It's not the end of the conversation. And then to the unsung heroes who make sure that the technical pieces stay in line, also thank you for that. And then thank you, Nabil. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele. And thank you, Janez. I think we're right on time. So I wish you a good rest of Thursday, 23rd of June.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
bye.
Very
Bye.
much. Thank you.